Story 3.
Back in 2007, when I was 20, I had just gotten my driver's license in January, which opened up a world of freedom for me. I started taking solo road trips, one of which led me a couple of states over to visit a friend for a weekend. It was a Friday in July, and I set off way later than planned. By the time I hit the road, it was already dark, and being a new driver, the night driving made me pretty anxious. After a few hours, I pulled into a gas station for fuel and some snacks to get me through the final stretch. As I was walking towards the store, I noticed a man approaching me. He was probably in his early 40s, short, maybe around 5 feet, wearing a plain black t-shirt and jeans, with dark brown hair. I saw he had parked his black pickup a few spaces from mine. He looked at me with this intense, unsettling stare, which immediately set off alarm bells. He started asking questions: if I was local, where I was heading, and if I knew any fun spots around. I brushed him off with a quick no, thinking he was just some random creepy guy. But then, unexpectedly, he invited me to play mini-golf or go to a movie with him. I didn't even look at him as I declined and kept walking towards the store. Then, as I was about to enter, he suddenly yelled, "Hey!" in a way that was far too harsh, startling even a family nearby. I ignored him and went into the store. But I soon realized he'd followed me in and was watching me. Nervous, I ducked into the bathroom and texted my friend about this guy, staying in the stall for a good 10 minutes. When I finally came out, I didn't see him anywhere and felt a bit of relief as I headed back to my car. As I started fueling up, I was relieved to see his truck was no longer there. But just as I was pulling out of the parking lot, I heard a loud, insistent honking. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw his black pickup behind me. He was signaling and shouting for me to pull over. Terrified, I sped back onto the highway on-ramp, with him tailing me for a few exits. I called my friend, my heart pounding. Eventually, he stopped following, but the rest of my drive was tense. I constantly checked my mirrors, not daring to stop until I finally reached my friend's house. Thankfully, the weekend was fun, despite the unnerving experience. For years, I didn't think much of that night until about 6 years later, during a conversation with a friend who loves true crime stories. I told her about my encounter, half-jokingly saying the man might have been a serial killer. Intrigued, she started searching for details on active serial killers in the area at that time. That's when we came across the name Adam Leroy Lane. My blood ran cold. The photos matched exactly, and both the location and time aligned. Lane had been convicted of 2 murders and an assault. The realization haunted me and reminded me of how close I'd come to real danger. Since then, I've been more cautious, especially at night, and my thoughts go out to the victims and their families who weren't as lucky as I was that night.
Story 2.
In my early 20s, fresh out of college, I lived in some pretty sketchy but affordable apartments in the US. The walls in my building were so thin that I could hear almost everything happening around me. My neighbor to the left was always blasting his music, but it didn't really bother me. I'd just turn up my own music to drown it out. One night, though, I could tell he'd been drinking heavily. I could hear him stumbling around his apartment and yelling at his girlfriend, which sadly wasn't unusual. When things got loud like that, I'd usually try to escape the noise, so I decided to go out with friends since it wasn't too late yet. We went to a few clubs and had a good time. Around 1 a.m., my friends dropped me back at my apartment. As we drove into the parking lot, I noticed my neighbor crouched between some parked cars and the building. I brushed it off as him just being his usual creepy self, but my friends were definitely weirded out. I assured them it was fine, so they dropped me off by the gate to make their exit easier. But as I walked toward the building, my heart sank. I noticed my neighbor standing completely still, hidden among the bushes between 2 of the buildings. As I got closer, I could tell he didn't realize I'd spotted him. To break the tension, I gave a little wave and said a quick hello. He slowly stepped out from the bushes into the dim light, not saying a word, but just staring at me with his eyes wide and fully dilated. It was eerie, but I tried to ignore it, heading straight into my apartment. Once inside, I was exhausted, so I went straight to bed, trying to shake off the encounter. But all night, I heard strange thumps and the sound of furniture moving next door. The next morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of police banging on my neighbor's door, yelling, "USA Police Department!" Relief mixed with dread as I wondered what they were doing there. I heard them take him away in handcuffs, and shortly after, they knocked on my door. They asked when I'd last seen him, and I told them everything: the yelling, the encounter in the parking lot, and the noises I'd heard throughout the night. Then came the news that would haunt me forever. The officer told me my neighbor had murdered his girlfriend that night. He dragged her body into a ditch behind our apartment building. In that moment, I realized that when I saw him in the parking lot, I was looking at a person who had just taken someone's life. To this day, the thought of how close I was to danger is chilling. I was just steps away from someone who had committed such a horrific act, and he had been lurking in the darkness as I walked past. Not long after, I moved to a better part of town, hoping to leave that nightmare behind.
Story 1.
At 22, I had just come out of an abusive relationship, and I was struggling mentally. Nights alone in my empty apartment were hard, so when my friends invited me to a hockey game to help take my mind off things, I happily went along. It was a Friday night, and as the game went on, we'd had a fair share of drinks. After the game, we hit a bar in the arena where I started chatting with a couple of guys next to me in line. One of them asked for my number, and in my vulnerable state, I gave it to him, even though I probably shouldn't have. Eventually, we called it a night and parted ways, but instead of heading home, I texted the guy from the bar. He replied quickly, offering to pick me up in an Uber and take me to his place. Without much thought, I agreed. After a 45-minute drive, we arrived, and I realized we were far from the city, in the middle of nowhere. His house looked abandoned, but despite my instincts, I followed him inside. The inside was pristine, almost unnaturally clean, like a hospital. He poured us both a glass of red wine, and although I remember him pouring it in front of me and even taking a sip himself, that's the last thing I remember. I woke up the next morning in a bedroom with sunlight streaming through the window. Hearing the shower running, I felt groggy and disoriented, but as my memory came back, panic set in. I needed to leave. I searched the room for my phone, clothes, and wallet, but found nothing. I quietly left the bedroom, hoping to sneak out before he finished his shower. As I made my way to the front door, my stomach dropped. The entire apartment was covered in plastic shower curtains, something I didn't remember from the night before. On the kitchen counter, I found my belongings, alongside a large knife that looked more like a hunting knife than anything from a kitchen. My instincts kicked in, and I grabbed my things and ran out the door, sprinting down the road without looking back. After about 10 minutes of running, I finally stopped to call a friend to pick me up. Once home, I blocked his number and have never heard from him again. Looking back, I wish I had gone to the police, but at the time, I wasn't in a stable place, and I didn't even know where his house was or his last name. What haunts me most is the realization of how close I may have come to real danger. The plastic covering, the knife, and the fact that my ID was missing all led me to believe that his intentions were far darker than I'd thought. But I'll never really know, and maybe that's for the best.